Happy Monday, Laila. I hope you had a happy Easter, and I hear that you're getting healthier, and maybe you're going to get to come back to DeMont, Indiana soon. So I'm praying for you and your mom and your dad and all of your brothers and your sister. And today, I'm back in Indiana. I've been gone a little bit, and so I'm in the workroom, and I am having a little tea party with you. Good stuff. So when you get back, we're going to have a tea party. Okay, it's a date. So I thought I hadn't read for about a week, so I thought I'd read you some Gooney Bird. Well, I think we're ready for chapter 5 of Gooney Bird Greene by Lois Lowry. On Tuesday, all of the children, including Felicia Ann, arrived at school early. Even Malcolm, who had never been early before. Tricia had a flower in her hair. Ben was wearing a vest. Kiko had a tiny bit of pink lipstick on her lips. And Barry Tuckerman was wearing a polka dot bow tie. Laila, Will wore a bow tie yesterday for Easter. I bought him a bow tie to wear for his 8th grade graduation, so he decided to wear it for Easter. I'll have to show you a picture, okay? Back to the story. Good morning, class, Mrs. Pigeon said. Don't you all look nice today? You do too, Mrs. Pigeon, the children said, and Mrs. Pigeon blushed. Well, she said, I thought I'd wear my new shoes today. Usually, Mrs. Pigeon wore soft, comfortable, sensible shoes, but today she was wearing very shiny, high-heeled shoes with golden buckles. The principal, Mr. Leroy, made an announcement on the intercom. He announced a bake sale and a birthday and a meeting of the crossing guards. A 5th grade boy read a poem about Christopher Columbus over the intercom. Everyone in the school said the Pledge of Allegiance together, and then it was time for school to begin. But Gooney Bird wasn't there. Well, Miss Pigeon said, let's take out our social studies books, class, and let's turn to the chapter called Cities. But Gooney Bird isn't here, Nicholas called. No, Mrs. Pigeon said, she isn't. She seems to be absent. Maybe she has the chicken pox. The class was silent. The room seemed very sad. The lights seemed dim. Even the gerbils, who usually scurried around in their cage, were rather subdued. George Washington, in his portrait on the wall, looked as if he might even cry at any moment. Slowly, the children took out their social studies books, and they turned to the chapter called Cities. Kiko began to cry very quietly. I don't want to do social studies, she whimpered. I feel too sad. Malcolm crawled under his desk and he curled up in a ball, and suddenly the door to the room burst open, and it was Gooney Bird. It's Gooney Bird, everybody called. The lights seemed to brighten. The gerbils began to run around in circles, and George Washington even seemed to smile. Gooney Bird was out of breath. I'm sorry that I'm late. I'm never, ever late for anything. I always set 3 alarm clocks, and I lay out my clothes the night before, and I even put paste on my toothbrush before I go to bed at night so that I can just brush my teeth quickly in the morning. Wait, she said. I gotta catch my breath. She stood in front of the class and took a few deep breaths. There, she said, I'm feeling fine now. She smoothed down her red hair, which was flying about. She tucked it behind her ears. Today, she was wearing gray sweatpants, a sleeveless white blouse with a lacy collar, and amazing black gloves that came up to her elbows. So kind of like fancy gloves that you might wear with a fancy ball gown, maybe. This morning, she explained, I quite unexpectedly had to direct an orchestra. An orchestra? Asked Mrs. Pigeon. Yes, a symphony orchestra. Miss Pigeon smiled. I hear all sorts of interesting excuses for tardiness, but I have never heard that one before. I believe I'm quite unique, Gooney Bird said. Yes, you are indeed. Did you wear your gloves when you were directing the orchestra? Why, yes, said Gooney Bird. As a matter of fact, I did. I found them very helpful. All of the second graders had their hands in the air and were pretending to lead orchestras. Even Malcolm was back in his seat using 2 pencils as orchestra batons. Gooney Bird headed towards her desk. She looked around at the other children's open books. I see we're in the middle of social studies, she said. Miss Pigeon slipped one foot out of her high-heeled shoe and rubbed it with the back of her hand. Then she put her shoe on. Actually, she said, I think the class would appreciate it if we held story time a little early today. Yay! Called all the children, and they closed their social studies books. A Gooney Bird story? Gooney Bird asked. Yes, said Miss Pigeon. Yes! Called all of the children. Gooney Bird smoothed her long gloves. She went back to the front of the room. Which one would you like to hear today? She asked. How Catman was consumed by a cow? I would certainly like to hear about Catman and the cow sometime, Miss Pigeon said. Maybe tomorrow? But this morning, I would like to hear one called Why Gooney Bird Was Late for School because she had to direct a symphony orchestra. Oh, Gooney Bird said. All right, I could tell that one. And it will be absolutely true? Asked Miss Pigeon. Of course, Gooney Bird said. Have you forgotten? All of my stories are absolutely true. Then she curtsied and began. Why Gooney Bird was late for school because she was directing a symphony orchestra by Gooney Bird Greene. Once upon a time, in fact, it was just this very morning, Gooney Bird Greene got up and got dressed in clothes that she had carefully laid out the night before. She ate her breakfast, brushed her teeth with her pre-pasted toothbrush, gathered up her homework, put on her elbow-length gloves, and started off to Water Tower Elementary School. Gooney Bird interrupted herself for a moment. She explained to the teacher in the class, sometimes, class, stories start in the most ordinary way. Then they become exciting when something unexpected happens. Don't you find that to be true? The children nodded, thinking about their favorite stories, like Where the Wild Things Are, Ben suggested, or Little Red Riding Hood. Beanie said, when the wolf appears and you don't expect it. Oh, I'm so scared of that wolf, Kiko whispered. Every time the wolf appears, Shh, the children said. And Gooney Bird continued. Gooney Bird walked down Park Street and turned the corner onto Walnut Street. And when she was halfway down Walnut and halfway to school, suddenly she paused. I've explained before, class, she said, about the word suddenly. It makes things exciting. Sometimes, class, if you're creating a story and you get stuck, just say the word suddenly, and you won't have any trouble continuing at all. What a good idea, Mrs. Pigeon said. We should start a list called Writing Tips. What happened suddenly on Walnut Street, Gooney Bird? Gooney Bird continued. Suddenly, she saw an enormous red and white bus coming very slowly. Each window had a head in it. The bus was quite full of people. Gooney Bird was amazed, even though she had lived in Water Tower only a short time, about a week. She knew the town of Water Tower did not have an enormous red and white bus. Water Tower had 2 medium-sized yellow buses. Gooney Bird knew that. And she knew also that one of the water tower churches had a small white bus, really a long van, that had a rainbow painted on its side, and it said, "Jesus is Lord," on each side. But an enormous red and white bus was completely new to Water Tower. As Gooney Bird watched, it moved very, very slowly down Walnut Street. She could see that the driver, though he was steering carefully, was also trying to look at a map in his hands. The bus driver saw Gooney Bird. He beeped his horn, beep, beep, in a very small beep. He pulled the bus to a stop with a breathy sound of the brakes, and then he pushed the handle that opened the folding door. Excuse me, the bus driver said. You look as if you are on your way to school. Yes, I am, Gooney Bird replied, and I certainly don't want to be late. I am never, ever late. The bus driver looked as if he might begin to cry. I feel exactly the same way, he said. I'm never, ever late, but this morning I am having a terrible problem. And he held up his unfolded map. Do you need help folding your map? Gooney Bird asked. It is hard to fold a map. But I find that if you follow the creases very carefully... No, the bus driver said. My problem is that I'm lost. Oh, dear, Gooney Bird said. And the driver continued, we were going to be late for our concert. A concert? Yes, I have an entire symphony on this bus, and a symphony orchestra, and we are going to be late. Gooney Bird paused. Questions about the orchestra, class? She asked. Class? Barry Tuckerman was waving his hand wildly. We know all the parts of the orchestra. We listened to A Young Person's Guide to Orchestra. Winds, called Ben. Strings, Trisha called. She pretended to be playing an imaginary violin. Brass, Chelsea called. She tried to make a trombone noise. Brr, 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 brr. Not very successfully. Percussion, said Malcolm loudly, and he began to tap his pencils in the rhythm on his desk. And also, Barry called out, with his hand still waving in the air, we listened to Peter and the Wolf. Oh, Kiko said in a small voice, I hate it when the wolf comes. Every time the wolf appears, Shh, the children said. Gooney Bird continued. So Gooney Bird climbed the steps, got onto the bus, and every seat was filled. There were men and women in the bus, all of them dressed in black. All of the men were wearing turtleneck shirts. The women were wearing long black skirts. They definitely looked like an orchestra, but they looked very distressed. Where are you supposed to go? Gooney Bird asked the bus driver. To the town hall auditorium, he said. We are supposed to play a concert there this morning. He looked at his watch. It begins in 20 minutes, he said in a worried voice. I will get you there, Gooney Bird said. The bus driver called to the orchestra players. This wonderful girl is going to direct us, he said. Yay! The orchestra players all cheered, luckily. Even though she lived in Watertown for only 1 week, Gooney Bird knew exactly where the town hall auditorium was, because her father had pointed it out when they drove around the town. This is the hospital, her father had said. Go there if you happen to fall from a ladder and break your arm. There is the police station, he said. Go there if you happen to see a bank robber on the loose. And there is the town hall auditorium, her father said. Go there if you want to see a ballet or a concert. Start the bus, Gooney Bird told the driver, and turn right at the very next corner. It was a good thing that she was wearing her long black gloves. When she pointed, everyone could see her long pointing fingers. There was no place for Gooney Bird to sit down, and we all know that it is dangerous to stand while a bus is moving, but she had no choice. So she stood right beside the driver and held on to the side of his seat, and he promised to drive very, very carefully. Next, turn left, Gooney Bird said, and she pointed. And there we are, she told him. See that large brick building? That is the town hall auditorium. Yay! the orchestra players called, and the women began to comb their hair. Thank you for directing us, they all said to Gooney Bird as they got out of the bus. The driver had opened the luggage compartment and was lifting out cellos. You will be late for school, one man said as he picked up a large black case. Trombone, he explained. Yes, I will, Gooney Bird said. I will be tardy. Is there some way that we can thank you for leading our orchestra, he asked. Gooney Bird thought a minute. Finally, she thought of a way, and she whispered it to the trombone player. Yes, he said, we would do that. So one by one, the musicians thanked Gooney Bird. She said goodbye, and she hurried down the street to Water Tower Elementary School. She arrived at school just as the class was about to read cities in their social studies books. The end. Questions, anyone? Gooney Bird asked. Was there a drum player? Malcolm asked. Yes, Gooney Bird said. Every single part of the symphony orchestra was there, even a harp. Oh, Malcolm said, sighing. I wish I could have seen the drum player. I love the drums. You will, Gooney Bird said. Was there a flute player? Chelsea asked. 2, Gooney Bird said. I have a question, Gooney Bird. Miss Pigeon raised her hand and said, what is it that you whispered to the trombone player? It's a secret, Gooney Bird said, but you will find out at 12 o'clock sharp. That's lunchtime, Miss Pigeon pointed out. Precisely, Gooney Bird said. Now, shall we turn to our social studies books? All morning, the children and Pigeon, too, glanced again and again at the big clock on the wall. They did social studies and arithmetic and had a snack in the middle of the morning. They did reading and art, and finally... I lost my place, Laila. Finally, just as the hands of the clock moved to 12, the second graders were about to reach for their lunch boxes. Gooney Bird announced, Hey, there they are! She pointed out the window on the side of the classroom, and the children all stood up, and they watched through the windows as a red and white bus pulled up and parked. And when the doors of the bus opened up wide, the orchestra players came out one by one, holding their instruments. They arranged themselves in a semicircle on the lawn, facing Water Tower Elementary, and the conductor, holding his baton, stepped to the center, lifted up his arms. Too bad he doesn't have long black gloves, Gooney Bird murmured. Miss Pigeon opened the windows so that they could hear better, and the orchestra began to play slow, stately music, a melody, I'm quite sure. And when it was finished, the conductor bowed. Then he turned to the windows and explained, That was a sarimbade. It's a kind of dance. We'll play it one more time in honor of Gooney Bird Greene. So the orchestra played the short sarabande again, and the class danced around the classroom in a serious, graceful way. The end of chapter 5. Laila, I hope you enjoyed Gooney Bird today, and I hope that whether it is or not, you make today great.